time for today's Learning to Hunt podcast. On today's agenda we have Firearms 101. And here's your host, Kenton Garwood.
Welcome everybody to another edition of the Learning to Hunt podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today, whether you're listening or potentially seeing us, as this is our first episode. We are actually filming the whole thing, and we're doing that because we have some visuals. As you can see, I have a table in front of me full of guns, firearms. So today we're going to go through and talk about the absolute basics of firearms. Now, if you've shot guns before, 99.9% of this you probably already know. But I want to make sure that as we go forward in the future and get into more technical stuff, we're all starting at the same baseline. We all have a good foundation of what we're doing with guns. So before we get into shooting techniques and picking out the right type of ammunition for a particular game species, we want to start with the basics, start with the parts of the gun, how they functioned, and build our foundation from there. Now to start with, let's look at a couple different types of firearms that are available. First up would be a rifle. So a rifle is meant to shoot a single projectile that we call a bullet. And the reason that these are called rifles is that on the inside of the barrel, there's actually grooves on the inside. And what that does is it spins the bullet. Now those grooves are called rifling. That's why we get the name rifle, because they are guns that have rifling. So I'm going to be going through all the different parts of the gun as they come up. So I mentioned the word barrel. The barrel is this long metal tube on the end of the gun, and it's responsible for directing where that bullet goes. It guides it as it goes downrange. The barrel is also responsible, it contains, stamped on it somewhere, is the make of the gun, the model of the gun, any kind of manufacturer serial numbers, and also what projectiles it will shoot. Now that's very important because you can't just throw any bullet inside of a particular gun. They are very specified. So every single barrel has stamped on it what it can shoot. It's very important. So going from the rifle, we have what we would consider to be a shotgun. Now a shotgun is not meant to shoot a single projectile, but multiple projectiles. Now we would want to do this in situations where we're shooting at flying targets, is usually what it's used for. Sometimes stationary targets, but usually if they're flying. So if they're flying, one little bullet is going to be really hard to hit something. So a shotgun shoots shot. And shot is a group of BBs that spread out. So instead of one projectile, you got a whole bunch of them, and they kind of spread out as they go to make it easier to shoot those flying targets. That's why we call it a shotgun. It shoots shot. Now shotguns that do this have what we call a smooth bore. Instead of that rifling inside of the rifle barrels, inside of a shotgun barrel, there isn't rifling. It's smooth. Because we don't want to try and spin that big group of BBs. We want to just let them go and let them spread out. Now there are shotguns that do have rifled barrels. And this is actually a barrel specifically for a shotgun, but it is a rifled one. So a shotgun can be used to shoot a single projectile with a rifled barrel. We call those projectiles slugs. So if a shotgun has a slug barrel on it, sometimes we refer to it as a slug gun, but it's still a shotgun. In general purposes, they're made to shoot shot, little BBs. Now on shotguns, the stock is very important. So this part here that you hold with your hand, along with this part, are very important in shotgunning because that is where the fit of the gun comes in. If the stock is too big on a shotgun, it's very hard to get good with it because it doesn't fit you right. So when we talk about the fit of a gun, usually that's referring to the stock, the big wooden part, the handle. So some guns have an extra piece, and it's known as the fore end. So that's this separate stock piece. It's still part of the stock, but it's a separate piece than the whole thing. Now next up we would have a muzzle loader. Now this is essentially the same thing as a rifle. It just gets loaded a little differently. As the name implies, it's loaded from the muzzle of the barrel and not the breech of the barrel. So within the barrel there's different parts. The downrange end is called the muzzle. The end nearest the trigger is called the breech. Well, on muzzle loaders we actually put the bullet in the muzzle end and push it all the way down into the breech end. So powder and bullet go in this end, and then in the breech end we still have to put our ignition system, our ignition source, our primer as they're called. And that goes in the breech plug. So at the breech end of the barrel is a breech plug that takes the force of the bullet going out and holds our ignition system. Now there is another extra part found on muzzle loaders that isn't found on shotguns or rifles, and that is this little thing here, which actually comes out. This is called a ramrod. And this is what we take and push that bullet down to where it needs to be. So that's why there's this little extra tube on the end of the muzzle loader, the ramrod. Finally, in terms of types of guns, we have what we would consider to be pistols or handguns. And these are essentially just modified rifles to be used with one hand and very maneuverable. So instead of having a big stock on the end of the gun, we have just a small grip. So you can actually grip it with one hand. So there's a couple other parts that I want to talk about before we move on. The first being the trigger. Now we probably all know what the trigger is. On this one it's actually gold colored, so you can see it a little easier. But the trigger is what you pull, that's what you operate to fire the weapon. Now somewhere within the trigger assembly is what we call a safety. Now every gun has a safety, or at least they should. I think there are some older ones that didn't have a safety, but everything manufactured nowadays does have a safety. So there's a little lockout button, and what that button does is prevents the gun from firing even if you pull the trigger. Some of them stop the trigger, some of them disengage the firing mechanism, but they're all meant to, if you accidentally pull the trigger with the safety on, the gun will not fire. Now every gun has it, but they're all kind of different. So it's very important whenever you're shooting a gun to know what that safety is, how to operate that safety mechanism. The safety could also lock back the hammer and prevent it from working. Now the hammer is this little piece right here. And it is responsible for pushing the firing pin forward. And the firing pin is what actually ignites the primer. So the safety is going to prevent either the hammer or the trigger or something from allowing the gun to fire. Very important to know. Also, so most rifles and shotguns and pistols have some way to hold additional ammunition. So it's not just the one being ready to be fired, there's a couple waiting that can be used to be fired. Now the device that holds the ammo is called the magazine. And there's two types of magazines. There's integrated magazines, so this one has this little tube on the end, and you can see this gap in the tube is shaped like a bullet. So if you pull the rod out, you can load bullets in here. And I can't remember how many this one holds, 9 or 10, but you put bullets in and then they're ready to go when you need them. Now if the magazine is removable, it's called a clip. Now these are a couple clips that I have. This one's for a small rifle, but they actually hold the ammunition separate from the gun, and then you can put them into the gun. And so then you've got your ammo storage there. These are still magazines, but we can call them clips if they're removable. The integrated magazines we cannot call clips. Clips are removable. And here's a couple that for this pistol. So you can see there's bullets in the clip, and then the clip goes into the gun. So that's how you can have more than one bullet in the gun, even though it's only shooting one at a time. Okay, so in that path of the bullet, we've got where they're stored. How do they get to being ready to be fired? Let's use this one. So this portion of the gun right here is what's known as the receiver. It's kind of the meat of the gun, the main frame and body of it. The receiver actually takes the bullet from either the clip or the magazine and gets it into position to be fired. But how does it do this? Well, it's what's known as the action of the gun. The action is the process, the system in which a bullet goes from storage to ready to be fired. And there's a bunch of different actions, and they're all kind of different, and we're going to go through those. The first one would be a single shot. So this would kind of be like the muzzle loader here. It's got capacity for one bullet. That's all that can be in it at a time. And if this was a shotgun, we would call this a break open action, because the gun actually kind of breaks on a pivot and opens up. So a break open action would be one where if this was a breech loading shotgun, you would just stick the shot shell into the end of the barrel. That would be considered a single shot. Now, and some shotguns actually have more than one barrel. So we have double barrel shotguns. So there's two barrels. Now, I don't actually have one here, but there's two different ways that these are configured. There can be ones where the barrels are side by side. So you have a left barrel and a right barrel. Usually these have two separate triggers, but they would still be a break open action. The other configuration for double barrel shotguns is what we call an over-under. So there's a top barrel and a bottom barrel. Now these would still be break open actions, so you'd break the gun open and actually place shells in manually. Those are kind of the single shot actions. Another action, and this is, at least at one time, was probably the most prevalent, is what we would call a bolt action. So this handle right here controls the bolt that's inside the receiver. So on a bolt action, it is a manually operated bolt. So I pick the handle up, I pull the handle out, the next bullet gets fed from, this one actually has a clip. Pop it out. So the bullets are in the clip is in the gun, the bullets are fed up to the bolt, and then the bolt moves forward and pushes it into the breech of the barrel. So that's what we would consider to be a bolt action. Now those are generally more used on rifles, but actually my turkey gun over here is a bolt action shotgun. Same thing. Pick the handle up, pull it back, the next round would get fed up, and you push it into place. So bolt action shotgun, bolt action rifle. Another action is what's called a lever action. This one right here is a lever action, and these are really fun to shoot. Because what you do is you actually put your index finger works the trigger, but your three other fingers are inside this extended piece of the trigger guard. And what it does is it actually opens downward. So the trigger guard actually opens downward, and that works the action of the gun. And then you close it back up for the next round. So on this one you'd have to fire it, open it up to eject the round that's in there, and then when you close it, the next round gets put into place. So when you're shooting a lot, these are fun. You can really get into some motion with them. But that would be a lever action. Now, a lot of shotguns are what we call pump action. So this is a pump action shotgun. So the fore end, remember we talked about the fore end, is actually attached to a plunger that's inside the gun. And when we pull it back, that's the same thing as pulling the bolt back or pulling the lever open. It opens up the receiver for the next shell to come in, and then when we close it, it puts it into place. And this is kind of the classic sound that pump shotguns make. Really popular for shotguns, and so that would be the pump action. We have what's considered to be a automatic action, or a fully automatic action. Now, I don't have one of these, but these are guns where the action is worked by the gun automatically. Now, with a fully automatic weapon, it will continue to shoot with a trigger pull. So when you pull the trigger, the gun is going to cycle the next round in and fire it. Cycle, fire, cycle, fire, cycle, fire. It's going to continue to do that if you hold the trigger down. Aren't really used too much for hunting situations and shooting situations, kind of military type guns, that sort of thing. But what we do use is what's considered a semi-automatic rifle or shotgun. And kind of the same thing in that the gun operates the action. So when you fire it, the action will open, ejecting the round, and then closes, inserting the next round. But the difference is, in a semi-automatic, you can't just hold the trigger down and it keeps shooting. It won't do that. Every time you pull the trigger and it cycles the next round in, you have to pull the trigger again to shoot. So a lot of times these semi-automatics get confused with fully automatics. A semi-automatic is no different than manually working the action, other than the gun's doing that part. But it's still fire the gun works the action, fire the gun again. So that's a big difference between semi-auto and fully auto. The pistol here is a semi-automatic pistol. So once it's loaded, every time I pull the trigger, it will cycle the next round into the chamber, into the receiver. There is another type of pistol called a revolver, and this is kind of the standard old school 6-shooter type. And they have a rotary magazine in the gun that you place the bullets into, and it rotates on every shot. So that's like the old cowboy style 6-shooter. That's called a revolver. So those are pretty much the different actions that guns can have. Break open or single shot, bolt action, lever action, pump action, automatic, and semi-automatic. And a revolver. Now another thing we need to talk about, and we're not going to cover this in great detail because when we get to actually shooting, we'll talk about how we actually aim. But on top of the barrel, you can see this and this little piece. These are the sights. Now this would be considered the front sight at the muzzle of the gun, and this would be considered the rear sight at the breech of the gun. And they're all a little different. There's a whole bunch of different styles that these can be, and we'll cover those on a future episode when we get into actually shooting. But just know that front sight, rear sight, and then we also have an optical enhancing sight called a scope. And that's what this mechanism is here. This kind of short fat tube here actually has lenses in it that magnify what we're looking at. So like I said, we'll get into those on future episodes. But the other thing would be these little mounts here would be the scope rings. So if you hear about scope rings, that's what that is, the mount that attaches the scope to the gun. So I think that wraps up our discussion for today in terms of the firearms basics. Like I said, I just want to make sure we all start with a good, solid foundation that we can build upon in future episodes and increase our skills using these firearms. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you're catching us on YouTube, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. You can get notified that our future episodes are going to be coming out. And if you're just listening, go check our YouTube channel. This video is going to be posted, and you'll actually get to kind of see a little bit more than just hearing about what I'm talking here. As always, you can visit learningtohunt.com, see the show notes. I'll have a full list of all the vocabulary and parts that we went through today. And you can also ask any questions you may have. And however you're listening, please rate, review, subscribe. Those things are all still very important for us. And I look forward to seeing you all on the next episode. Thanks, everybody.